Everyone believed the disaster was the wedding. They were wrong. The real catastrophe had happened long before the flowers arrived, before the vows were rehearsed, before Avery Hart learned how to smile on command while standing just outside the frame. The wedding was only the moment when the truth briefly surfaced, when the role she had perfected slipped for less than a second and revealed how fragile the balance really was. Avery had learned how to hold other people's happiness the way one held a lit candle in a dark room, carefully, reverently, and always at arm's length. She did not remember when this instinct had formed, only that it felt older than adulthood, older than her career, older even than the city she lived in. It was not something she consciously chose. It was something she became. She was the woman who could walk into a crisis and make it smaller simply by being there. She absorbed tension, redirected panic, softened sharp edges. When something broke, she knelt and fixed it. When someone cried, she stood close enough to be useful, never close enough to drown. Chicago rewarded this kind of woman. The city thrived on people who knew how to function under pressure, who understood timing, who could make chaos look intentional. Avery moved through it with quiet efficiency, another polished figure in tailored clothing, another professional face among thousands. Yet her reputation preceded her in social circles. She was the one invited not because she was loud or magnetic, but because she was reliable. She remembered details. She anticipated needs. She stayed until the end and left without being asked. People called her indispensable as if it were a compliment, never realizing how closely it resembled a life sentence. Weddings were where this reputation reached its purest form. Avery did not plan them officially, did not charge for her services, did not wear a headset or carry a clipboard. She did not need to. She understood the anatomy of a wedding instinctively. She knew where stress gathered and how it spread. She knew the exact moment when joy tipped into hysteria. She knew which brides needed reassurance and which needed distraction. She knew how to become invisible while holding everything together. It was a strange intimacy, being so essential to moments that did not belong to her. Her face appeared in countless photographs from these events, always smiling, always present, never central. If you looked closely, you could trace her through other people's lives like a watermark, proof that she had been there without ever claiming the space. It took her years to realize that this pattern did not end with weddings. It extended everywhere. At work, in friendships, in family. She was always the supporting structure, never the architecture. By day, Avery worked inside the empire her father had built, though she would never have described it that way aloud. Hart Media Group was his legacy, his pride, his proof that charisma and ambition could be transformed into permanence. His name was carved into glass and letterhead, large and unmissable. Avery's name appeared in smaller print, in emails and internal documents, attached to deadlines met and problems resolved. He had built the company on risk. She maintained it through restraint. Where he commanded rooms, she stabilized them. Where he pushed forward, she held things together. Her office was immaculate, as controlled as her apartment. She disliked clutter because it suggested disorder, and disorder suggested vulnerability. She kept lists, calendars, backup plans. She anticipated crises before they erupted and neutralized them quietly. Her father relied on her in the way powerful men often relied on capable women, absolutely, and without acknowledgement of the cost. When he praised her, it was framed as expectation rather than gratitude. She was doing what she was supposed to do. She was holding the line. At home, Avery's life contracted into stillness. Her apartment was not lonely exactly, but it was deliberately sparse. Neutral colors, clean lines, no unnecessary objects. Everything had a place and nothing demanded attention. The silence there was not accidental. It was curated, chosen over noise because noise invited questions, and questions invited answers she did not want to give herself. The only living creature she allowed into that space was a small fish swimming slow circles in a glass tank by the window. She fed it at the same time every evening, watched it move through its limited world, and never touched it. She told herself this was kindness. She told herself it was enough. The wedding that disrupted her equilibrium took place high above the city, on a rooftop chosen for its view rather than its comfort. The river reflected the lights below, turning movement into illusion. The air was warm but unpredictable, carrying the faint scent of water and concrete. Everything was meticulously arranged. The couple was beautiful. The guests were elegant. The night promised perfection, and Avery was there to make sure that promise was kept. She moved through the event with practiced ease, adjusting details no one else noticed. A crooked boutonniere, a nervous mother, a misplaced place card. She solved problems before they registered as problems, smoothing the experience until it felt effortless. She wore a pale dress selected by committee, designed to complement without competing. It fit her well, flattering without drawing attention. She blended seamlessly into the celebration, exactly as intended. The moment it happened was insignificant in any measurable way. A chair slightly out of place, a hem catching on polished metal, a shift of weight that came half a second too late. But significance was not measured in seconds. It was measured in attention. And attention sharpened in that pause before applause when everyone's focus tightened like a held breath. Avery felt the pull before she understood it, felt her balance falter, felt gravity assert itself. Time stretched, thinning into something almost visible. She saw flashes of white and gold, heard the distant echo of music, sensed the collective awareness turning toward her. She did not fall. She caught herself, palms pressing into the table, body snapping back into alignment. But the damage had already occurred. The room registered it. Smiles flickered. A ripple of restrained amusement passed through the guests, not malicious, simply relieved. Someone else had almost fallen. Someone else had become momentarily human. In the past, Avery would have laughed. She would have waved it off, turned embarrassment into charm, reassured everyone that the illusion remained intact. This time she did not. She straightened slowly, breath steadying, face warm with the knowledge that she was being seen. When the applause resumed, louder and more enthusiastic than before, it felt performative, an attempt to erase what could not be undone. Avery accepted it without participation. For the first time, she allowed the moment to exist without softening it for others. It unsettled her more than the near fall itself. Something inside her shifted, subtle but irreversible. A recognition. She had spent years preventing disruption, smoothing surfaces, preserving appearances. And yet here she was, reminded how little control she actually possessed over how she was perceived. Later, as the evening dissolved into music and movement, she noticed him. He stood slightly apart from the central cluster of guests, not disengaged but observant. Noah Blackwell did not behave like someone attending a wedding for spectacle. His posture suggested awareness rather than excitement, a man accustomed to watching rather than performing. He was calm in a way that did not demand attention, composed without arrogance. His gaze moved through the room with precision, as if he were cataloging details for reasons unknown. When his eyes met hers, Avery felt exposed in a way she could not immediately explain. He did not look at her with pity or amusement. He did not look away. There was no invitation in his expression, no attempt to reassure or impress. What unsettled her was the absence of expectation. It felt like truth without commentary. She learned his name through fragments, overheard remarks, casual references. A friend of the groom. In town briefly, between projects, temporary. He belonged to no visible category, which made him difficult to dismiss. He spoke little, moved with economy, and seemed acutely aware of the space around him. There was something almost anticipatory about him, as if he were used to danger appearing without warning. Avery found herself thinking, irrationally, that he was someone who survived things. The encounter lingered long after she left the rooftop. It followed her through empty streets and into the quiet of her apartment. The city lights cast sharp reflections across her floor, turning familiar spaces into something colder. Her answering machine blinked, insistent. Her father's voice filled the room, brisk and irritated, reminding her of a crisis waiting in the morning and instructing her, once again, not to complicate things with emotion. The message ended abruptly. It always did. As she set her bag down, her phone vibrated. A notification from a dating app she had never taken seriously appeared on the screen. A match, Noah Blackwell. The coincidence struck her with the force of an accusation. Avery stared at the name as if it were evidence, something that demanded interpretation. She did not believe in randomness. She believed in patterns, in cause and effect. This felt like neither. It felt like intrusion. She stood alone in her immaculate apartment, the soft hum of the city pressing against the windows, and felt something unfamiliar tighten in her chest. It was not hope. It was not excitement. It was the sense that her carefully maintained invisibility had been compromised. That someone had seen past the role she played and chosen to look anyway. Avery had spent her life keeping her hands steady, holding other people's candles so they would not burn. For the first time, she wondered what would happen if she let her own flame exist, even briefly, without protection. The building welcomed Avery Hart the same way it always did, with glass doors that reflected her back at herself before allowing her inside. She looked composed, efficient, unchanged by the night before. Anyone watching would have assumed she had slept well, that nothing had followed her home from the rooftop except the faint smell of champagne and city air. The illusion held because it always did. Avery had mastered the art of arriving as if nothing had happened. Even when something had shifted so deeply, it altered the way the ground felt beneath her feet. The Hart Media Group came alive early. Screens lit up. Phones rang. Assistants moved with quiet urgency. Avery slipped into this rhythm as naturally as breathing. Her heels echoed down the hallway with measured confidence. She answered emails before they were finished being written. She flagged problems before they became visible. She existed in a constant state of preemption, solving futures that had not yet arrived. It was a skill that had once felt empowering and now felt compulsory. Her father summoned her before she could even sit down. His office was larger than necessary, designed to impress rather than comfort. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city as if it belonged to him, a territory he had conquered and now surveyed daily. He did not ask how she was. He did not mention the wedding. He spoke in numbers, projections, deadlines. Another quarter, another season, just a little longer. Without her, he implied, everything would fracture. He offered rewards the way one offered sedation. A higher title, more authority, more money, influence that could open doors Avery did not want to walk through. Each promise was wrapped in language that suggested generosity but carried the weight of obligation. She heard what he did not say, that she owed him, that her value lay in her usefulness, that leaving was betrayal. Avery listened without interruption, nodding at the right moments, absorbing his expectations as she always had. Inside, something tightened. She had wanted to write for as long as she could remember, not marketing copy, not strategic messaging, not the polished narratives designed to sell ideas she did not believe in. She wanted to write things that did not serve anyone's agenda, words that existed for their own sake. In the Hart family, that kind of desire had always been labeled impractical at best, selfish at worst. Dreams were indulgences. Stability was virtue. She returned to her desk with the familiar sensation of being held in place by invisible hands. The company did not need chains. It had history. It had guilt. It had a father who knew exactly which levers to pull. Avery completed her tasks with mechanical precision, but the work felt heavier than usual, as if gravity had increased overnight. Every email she sent felt like another stitch reinforcing a structure she was no longer sure she wanted to live inside. Mina noticed before anyone else did. She always did. Where others saw Avery's composure as strength, Mina recognized it as exhaustion refined into elegance. They met after work in a small cafe Avery had chosen for its anonymity. Mina arrived like weather, loud and warm and unapologetically present. She filled space without asking permission, a quality Avery both admired and feared. Mina watched Avery closely, cataloging the way she moved, the way her attention drifted. She saw what Avery did not say, that Avery had perfected disappearance to the point where she no longer knew how to arrive. Mina did not accuse. She did not console. She pressed where it hurt most. Avery was not unlucky in love. She was not broken. She was afraid of making a choice that could not be undone, afraid of choosing something and discovering it was wrong. The fear had roots. After her mother's death, Avery had learned a specific survival strategy. Do not rely, do not ask, do not hope too loudly. She had watched her mother remain in a marriage that hollowed her out, smiling carefully, forgiving endlessly, shrinking herself until there was almost nothing left. Avery had absorbed the lesson without meaning to. Love demanded surrender. Surrender led to erasure. Better to remain intact and alone than visible and wounded. That belief had guided her for years. It had also begun to suffocate her. Later that week, Avery attended a session with the pastor consultant her father respected, a man whose advice carried the weight of moral authority. She went because it was expected, because appearing balanced mattered, because saying no felt like inviting scrutiny she did not have the energy to manage. She spoke carefully, presenting a version of her life that sounded functional. Work, responsibility, grief processed neatly, filed away. But grief did not stay contained. It surfaced in fragments, her mother's silence, her mother's patience. The way forgiveness had been framed as virtue when it had looked so much like surrender. Avery had grown up believing marriage was not a partnership but a performance, one where endurance was praised and unhappiness was sanitized. She told herself that being alone was safer. That independence equaled dignity. Somewhere along the way, that equation had stopped protecting her and started shrinking her world. She left the session feeling lighter and heavier all at once. The clarity she gained did not bring relief. It brought responsibility. Seeing the pattern meant she could no longer pretend she was merely unlucky or misunderstood. She was choosing this life, even if she told herself she had no choice. That evening, her phone vibrated with a notification she had been both expecting and dreading. Noah Blackwell had sent a brief message. No pressure, no explanation, no follow-up when she did not respond. The restraint unsettled her more than persistence ever could have. Aggression would have given her something to reject. Persistence would have allowed her to feel justified in retreat. His quiet acceptance of silence felt like an open door she could not blame for being there. She stared at the screen longer than necessary, heart beating with an unfamiliar rhythm. His absence from her notifications after that single message felt intentional, respectful, and therefore dangerous. It removed her usual escape routes. It suggested he would not chase. It suggested the choice, if there was to be one, would belong to her. At home, the silence pressed in. The fish moved slowly through its glass enclosure, oblivious to the tension in the room. Avery fed it mechanically, watching the flakes dissolve. She wondered when she had decided that containment was kindness. She wondered how many versions of herself she had placed behind glass for safety. The confrontation with her father came later than expected and sharper. He accused without raising his voice, a tactic he had perfected. Ingratitude, disloyalty, disrespect to the family name. He invoked her mother like a shield, implying disappointment, implying betrayal. The words landed exactly where they were meant to. For years, Avery would have absorbed them, apologized, adjusted. This time, something stopped her. She did not argue, she did not defend herself. She listened, and when he finished, she left. She did not slam the door. She did not make a scene. She simply walked out, her exit quiet and irrevocable. The absence of drama felt louder than any confrontation they had ever had. Outside, the city felt vast and indifferent. The night air was cool against her skin. She stood on the sidewalk with nowhere to go, no immediate plan, just the unfamiliar sensation of having stepped out of something that had always held her in place. It did not feel like freedom. It felt like suspension. Her phone was in her hand before she consciously decided to use it. She opened the message thread she had been avoiding. Her response was simple, stripped of strategy. She agreed to meet. The act felt reckless and precise at the same time, like pressing an emergency button whose consequences could not be predicted. As she sent the message, Avery understood something she had spent years denying. The house that held her had never been just her father's company or her family's expectations. It had been the structure she built to avoid risk, to avoid longing, to avoid becoming her mother. Stepping outside of it meant exposure. It meant choosing uncertainty over safety. It meant admitting that being held was no longer the same as being alive. Avery arrived expecting friction. She expected the familiar discomfort of first meetings, the polite choreography of questions and answers, the subtle negotiations of power and presentation. She expected disappointment because disappointment was manageable. It fit into patterns she understood. What she did not expect was the absence of performance. The bar Noah chose existed in a liminal space, neither fashionable nor forgotten, pressed against the edge of a neighborhood that never quite decided what it wanted to be. The light inside was low but intentional, amber rather than dark, forgiving without hiding. Music pulsed just loudly enough to blur the edges of surrounding conversations, creating a pocket of privacy without isolation. It was a place designed for people who did not want to be seen too clearly and did not want to disappear entirely. Avery recognized the logic immediately and resented how accurately it fit her. She entered with her shoulders already braced, prepared to assess and be assessed. Her body carried the memory of dozens of first impressions, all of them calculated, all of them safe. She knew how to present herself as competent, interesting, unthreatening. She knew which parts of her life to offer and which to withhold. She sat down already editing herself, already anticipating the moment when she would need to disengage politely. Noah did not rush to fill the space. He did not lean forward with urgency or retreat with indifference. He occupied the moment as if it did not need managing. He asked questions without fishing, without steering toward predetermined outcomes. His attention was steady but not invasive. Avery noticed that he listened without planning his next move, a rarity she had almost forgotten was possible. The effect unsettled her. Without pressure, she felt exposed. She spoke about her work because that was the safest territory, the version of herself most easily summarized. She described her role in language she had used 100 times before, words polished smooth through repetition. As she spoke, she became aware of the hollowness in her own voice. The narrative sounded impressive, coherent, complete. It also sounded false, not untrue, but incomplete in a way that made her chest tighten. She heard herself the way an outsider might hear her, and felt a sharp dissonance between the story and the woman telling it. There was something else inside her, something she never led with. Nights spent writing in near silence. Pages hidden in folders labeled innocuously, drafts she never shared, sentences shaped and reshaped until they felt almost dangerous. Writing was not a hobby for her. It was a compulsion, a private ritual she treated with equal parts reverence and fear. She did not mention it. She never did. Noah noticed anyway. Not because she told him, but because of the pauses in her speech, the moments where her attention drifted inward, the way her hands stilled when she spoke about things that mattered less. He did not call it out. He did not push. The recognition existed without commentary, which made it impossible to deny. When they parted that night, Avery walked home with a sense of imbalance she could not categorize. Nothing dramatic had occurred. No lines had been crossed, no promises implied, and yet something had shifted. The chemistry between them felt wrong in a way that made her alert rather than comfortable. It did not soothe. It challenged. It did not offer escape. It offered proximity to herself. The week that followed refused to slow down. Mina, sensing movement where there had been stasis, inserted herself with characteristic force. She insisted Avery attend a small dinner with friends, the kind of gathering that masqueraded as casual while quietly displaying everything one was expected to want. Couples arrived in coordinated rhythms, conversations circling renovations, pregnancies, 5-year plans. Laughter flowed easily, layered with familiarity. The atmosphere was warm, intimate, and deeply alienating. Avery moved through the evening as a visitor rather than a participant. She smiled, nodded, asked the appropriate questions. Inside, she felt like an anthropologist observing a culture she had been told was hers by default but could not recognize as home. This life looked complete from the outside, self-sustaining and full. She could not imagine herself inside it without vanishing entirely. Noah appeared halfway through the evening, introduced as if his presence were incidental. Someone's colleague, someone's friend. He integrated seamlessly, not by dominating the space, but by matching its rhythm. He listened. He responded without overperforming. He fit in without trying to belong. The ease with which he moved among these people irritated Avery more than it should have. It suggested possibility. It suggested that the world she felt excluded from might not be as closed as she believed. She found herself watching him rather than the conversation, noting how he occupied proximity without possession, how he made room for others without shrinking himself. The pull she felt was not romantic in the conventional sense. It was a gravitational shift, a reorientation of attention. It made her restless. While this quiet disruption unfolded, another tension surfaced at work. A forgotten thread, buried deep in archived correspondence, emerged during a routine audit. Avery stumbled upon it accidentally, a series of emails dated years back, written in careful language that tried and failed to disguise intimacy. She read them once, then again, her pulse steady and her stomach cold. The truth revealed itself without drama. Her father had been unfaithful for years. Her mother had known. The realization did not arrive as shock. It arrived as confirmation. It explained everything Avery had never been able to articulate: her mother's gradual withdrawal, the way she learned to smile selectively, to speak carefully, to forgive without healing, the quiet erosion that had shaped the household. Love had not been absent. It had been compromised, managed, reduced to survival. Avery understood now why her mother had stayed and why that choice had haunted her. The knowledge functioned like poison. It seeped into every assumption Avery had made about relationships. Love was not safety. Love was damage control. Love was the art of enduring. She had internalized this belief so deeply she had mistaken it for wisdom. Sitting at her desk, staring at the screen, Avery felt something fracture. The structure that had held her worldview together began to crack. That night, she did not go home immediately. She walked the city until her feet ached, letting anger replace the numbness she had lived with for years. When the tears came, they were sharp and furious rather than soft. She cried not for herself as a victim, but for the inheritance she had never consented to carry. The fear, the restraint, the quiet resignation disguised as maturity. For the first time in a long while, Avery did not retreat. She did not close herself off or bury the feeling under responsibility. She went home, opened her laptop, and stared at a blank document. The cursor blinked like a dare. She began to write without knowing where she was going, words spilling out unfiltered, raw, and unpolished. She wrote the story she had always avoided, the one that acknowledged betrayal without sanctifying it, love without idealizing it, fear without justifying it. She lost track of time. The city outside dimmed. Her fish moved through its glass world unnoticed. Somewhere in the early hours, her phone lit up. Noah's name appeared, accompanied by no explanation, no demand, just presence. She did not tell him what she was doing or why she was awake. She did not need to. The knowledge that he was there, available without intrusion, anchored her in a way she did not yet understand. As dawn approached, Avery leaned back and read what she had written. It was imperfect. It was dangerous. It was hers. Exhaustion settled into her bones, but beneath it was something new, something fragile and alive. She realized then that what drew her to Noah was not his calm or his intelligence or even his kindness. It was the way he transformed fear from a verdict into a problem to be solved. That realization terrified her. Problems demanded engagement. Solutions required risk. And for the first time, Avery felt herself moving towards something she could not control. The months that followed unfolded with deceptive smoothness, the kind that invited belief. From the outside, Avery's life appeared to have slipped into a recognizable rhythm, one that people around her began to read as stability, even happiness. She and Noah moved through the city together in ways that felt almost cinematic. Long walks along the river when the light thinned into steel gray, quiet mornings in unfamiliar neighborhoods, late evenings that did not demand performance. These moments were not loud or dramatic. They accumulated slowly, like sediment, forming something that resembled a foundation. What made it dangerous was how ordinary it felt. Avery wrote every day, not out of discipline imposed by fear, but out of necessity. Writing had stopped feeling like an indulgence she had to hide and started feeling like a vital function. She wrote in the mornings before work, in stolen hours between meetings, at night when the city quieted into something she could breathe inside. The words came unevenly, sometimes brittle, sometimes urgent, but they came. For the first time, she felt a sense of expansion rather than maintenance. Life no longer felt like a series of obligations to be managed. It felt, tentatively, like something she was participating in. Noah became part of this landscape without disrupting it. He did not demand her attention or compete with her solitude. He existed alongside her work rather than in opposition to it. Over time, Avery began to notice the structure beneath his calm. His steadiness was not passive. It was engineered. He lived by routines that suggested survival rather than comfort. He planned, anticipated, prepared. His sense of the future was precise, not hopeful. He spoke of what came next, as if it were a set of coordinates rather than a dream. That precision both comforted and unsettled her. There was something reassuring in his certainty, in the way he treated life as a sequence of solvable problems. But beneath that discipline, Avery sensed the outline of loss. Whatever Noah had endured had taught him to rely on control, on foresight, on minimizing risk. His calm was not innocence. It was armor. At work, the shift was less subtle. Avery's father noticed the change in her before she acknowledged it herself. He had always been attuned to fluctuations in loyalty, in attention, in control. Where he once pressed, he now softened. The transformation was immediate and disorienting. He praised her publicly, credited her in meetings, framed her contributions as visionary rather than supportive. He spoke of succession in abstract terms, of shared leadership, of trust. He offered her a role that resembled partnership more than servitude. On paper, it was everything she had been denied: authority, recognition, influence, the ability to shape projects rather than merely sustain them. To anyone else, it would have looked like a long overdue victory. Avery felt the pull of it acutely. This was the life she had been trained for. The language, the power dynamics, the expectations all fit her fluently. But beneath the offer lay a familiar transaction. If she stayed, she would be tethered indefinitely. Her time would belong to the company. Her energy would be spent managing her father's legacy rather than creating her own. The softness in his voice did not erase the condition. She could have more, but only if she gave everything. The cage was gilded now, but it was still a cage. The timing was brutal in its symmetry. It was during this period of quiet momentum that Noah asked her to marry him. There was no spectacle, no public declaration, no attempt to turn the moment into proof of devotion. He did not kneel or dramatize. He spoke plainly, deliberately, as if making a statement he had already examined from every angle. The simplicity of it was what made it impossible to deflect. For Noah, it was an extension of the life they were already building. For Avery, it was a collision. The proposal did not register as romance. It registered as threat, not because she doubted his intentions or his character, but because the word itself detonated every unresolved memory she carried. Marriage was not a neutral concept in her mind. It was loaded with images she had spent years trying to dismantle. A mother who stayed, a father who betrayed, a household where love and endurance were conflated until they became indistinguishable. Her body reacted before her mind could intervene. Panic rose sharp and immediate, tightening her chest, narrowing her vision. Her thoughts accelerated into catastrophe. If she said yes, she would be choosing a path she had sworn to avoid, a structure that demanded permanence and promised nothing in return. If she said no, She would be confirming the fear she had always harbored about herself, that she was incapable of sustaining love, that intimacy would always outpace her courage. In her mind, the future fractured into extremes. One version showed her trapped, repeating her mother's life with better vocabulary but the same outcome. Another showed her alone, safe but hollow, having rejected the one thing she had not been able to dismiss as illusion. There was no middle ground in her imagination, only surrender or retreat. She asked for time. The request was reasonable. It was also devastating in its impact. The hesitation landed between them like a verdict neither of them wanted to hear spoken aloud. For Noah, who valued clarity as a form of respect, the pause felt like a destabilization. He understood hesitation as risk assessment, and in that moment, he saw himself placed on trial not for who he was, but for what happiness represented to her. Avery could sense the shift immediately. His composure faltered, just slightly, revealing the fault line beneath. He had been here before, she realized, not with her, but with the idea of being almost chosen. He recognized the signs of withdrawal before the act itself. The look in his eyes was not anger, it was recognition. Left alone in her apartment that night, Avery felt the weight of her decision press in from all sides. The city outside her windows seemed unusually distant, muffled, as if she were sealed off from it. She moved through the space slowly, noticing details she had ignored for years. The precision of her furniture, the emptiness of her shelves, the fish circling endlessly behind glass. The symbolism was no longer subtle. She had built a life around containment. She kept living things at a distance to prevent loss, convinced that restraint equaled care. The fish was alive because it was confined. Her relationships survived because they were limited. Nothing could hurt her if nothing could reach her. In the dark, the air felt thick, difficult to inhale. For the first time, Avery allowed herself to articulate the truth she had been circling for years. The problem was not marriage. It was not Noah. It was not even her father or her past. The problem was that she had learned how to be indispensable, reliable, necessary. She had never learned how to be wanted without conditions. She understood now that her fear was not of commitment itself, but of visibility. Love, real love, required presence without armor. It demanded being seen without a role to hide behind. That kind of exposure terrified her more than loneliness ever had. The realization did not bring relief. It brought grief. She had mistaken usefulness for worth for so long that disentangling the two felt like losing a limb. The life she had built had held her together, but it had also kept her small. The offer from her father and the proposal from Noah mirrored each other in a way that made her nauseous. Both promised security. Both demanded surrender. One would consume her time. The other would expose her soul. Standing alone in her carefully controlled apartment, Avery felt the trap close not because anyone had forced her into it, but because every path forward required a version of herself she had not yet learned how to be. The call arrived before the sky had decided what color it wanted to be. Avery woke to the vibration of her phone cutting through sleep like a blade, the sound sharp enough to erase dreams instantly. Mina was in labor. Too early. The words carried weight without drama, the kind that needed no explanation. Avery's body moved before thought could form, memory and instinct taking over. Clothes, shoes, keys. The apartment remained untouched behind her, sealed and quiet, as if nothing inside it were capable of urgency. The city at that hour felt provisional, streets half-lit, buildings reduced to silhouettes. Traffic was sparse, movement subdued, as though the world itself had not yet committed to the day. Avery drove through it with an unfamiliar tightness in her chest, not panic but anticipation of impact. She had spent her life preparing for other people's emergencies, but this one resisted categorization. It did not belong to her, yet it demanded her presence in a way she could not refuse. The hospital was already awake. Light spilled from every corridor, harsh and unflattering, stripping everything of nuance. The smell of disinfectant hung thick in the air, layered with something metallic that Avery could not name. Sounds overlapped without harmony, hurried footsteps, clipped instructions, bursts of laughter that felt misplaced but necessary. The place functioned on urgency rather than intention. Nothing waited to be ready. Mina's room was crowded with contradiction. Fear sat openly on her face, unmasked and unapologetic, while humor surfaced in inappropriate moments like a defense mechanism that refused to shut down. Machines hummed steadily, indifferent to emotion, measuring life in numbers and rhythms. Avery stood near the wall at first, watching, absorbing. She recognized the rawness immediately. There was no performance here, no attempt to soften reality for comfort. This was life stripped of ceremony. When the baby arrived, time collapsed inward. Everything else receded, becoming background noise. The child was impossibly small, skin flushed and fragile, chest rising with shallow determination. Avery felt her throat tighten as she watched life insist on itself without negotiation. There was no planning here, no preparation that could have guaranteed safety. Existence arrived anyway, unpolished and demanding. Holding the baby's hand was not an emotional gesture Avery had rehearsed. The contact startled her. The fingers curled reflexively around hers, weak but intentional, as if grasping were not a choice but a necessity. In that instant, something inside Avery rearranged itself. She felt the weight of her own restraint with brutal clarity. She had built her life around caution, around minimizing exposure, around choosing survival over participation. Standing there, she saw how narrow that choice had been. She did not cry then. The realization was too clean for tears. It settled into her bones quietly, irrevocably. Life did not wait for readiness. It did not negotiate terms. It happened, whether one felt prepared or not. Avery understood, perhaps for the first time, that her careful living had not protected her from loss. It had only delayed experience. She left the hospital hours later changed in ways that were difficult to articulate. The city outside had resumed its pace, indifferent to the transformation that had occurred inside those walls. People moved with purpose, unaware that anything had shifted. Avery walked among them feeling slightly out of alignment, as if she had glimpsed something fundamental and now had to pretend she had not. It was in this altered state that Noah told her about the transfer. The news arrived without tension, delivered with the same measured clarity that defined him. A new position, another state, a step forward that made sense within the architecture of his life. There was no romance attached to it, no fantasy of reinvention. It was pragmatic, deliberate, grounded in responsibility rather than escape. Avery heard finality in his calm. Not abandonment, not ultimatum, but resolution. Noah was moving toward something instead of orbiting it. He was doing what she had spent years avoiding. The contrast struck her hard. Where she hesitated, he advanced. Where she negotiated with fear, he accepted risk as part of living. Panic did not erupt immediately. It seeped in gradually, disguised as urgency, as motivation, as determination. Avery convinced herself that she needed to act, to demonstrate something essential before the opportunity disappeared. Time felt compressed, as if the future were closing in on her from all sides. She began offering pieces of herself like credentials. She showed Noah her manuscript, the pages she had protected with near superstition, the work that represented the truest version of herself she knew how to access. Handing it over felt like exposing something vital, something that could not be retrieved once seen. She watched him read with careful attention, searching his reactions for signs that this mattered, that she mattered, that the risk was justified. She went further. She bought a small hamster from a nearby pet store, convincing herself that learning to care for something that required touch would rewire her instincts. She told herself it was symbolic, an exercise in vulnerability. She held the animal in her hands despite the tremor in her chest, despite the fear that something living could be lost because of her. Each gesture felt intentional, almost ceremonial, as if she were building a case for her own transformation. The effort was sincere. It was also frantic. Avery was not inhabiting change. She was attempting to prove it. Noah saw the difference immediately. He recognized the pattern because he had lived its mirror image once before. Avery was not learning to trust. She was trying to secure certainty. Her openness came with conditions, with silent expectations of outcome. What she framed as growth functioned as control, another carefully designed enclosure meant to prevent pain rather than allow connection. The love between them did not disappear. It remained present, tangible, real, but it no longer anchored anything. Fear arrived before affection, shaping decisions before desire could breathe. Love became effortful, transactional, something Avery reached toward rather than rested inside. Noah understood then what he had resisted acknowledging. He could not move forward carrying someone who had not yet learned how to stand without armor. Their separation unfolded without spectacle. There were no dramatic scenes, no words sharpened into weapons. It was quiet, precise, almost surgical. That was what made it devastating. Without chaos, there was no distraction. Without blame, there was only truth. Avery could not accuse timing or circumstance or incompatibility. She had been loved without manipulation. She had been offered steadiness without demand. And she had been unable to receive it without turning it into a test. After Noah left, the apartment felt smaller, more artificial. The fish traced its endless loop behind glass, unchanged by the emotional geography of the room. The hamster slept curled into itself, unaware of the weight Avery had placed upon its existence. The manuscript lay open on the desk, words that now carried a different gravity, no longer private, no longer safe. Grief did not arrive as collapse. It arrived as clarity. Avery understood that she had not lost a relationship so much as momentum toward becoming someone capable of living unguarded. The realization hurt more deeply than heartbreak ever had. Love had not failed her. It had illuminated the work she had postponed. She did not rush to fix the pain. She did not search for meaning or redemption. She allowed the emptiness to exist without justification. Sitting alone in that controlled, curated space, Avery finally admitted the truth she could no longer avoid. Love was not a rescue. It was an exposure. And she had treated exposure as danger for so long that she had forgotten how to tell the difference. In the quiet aftermath, something shifted again, subtle but undeniable. If fear had been strong enough to dismantle love, then avoiding it was no longer an option. The loss did not signal failure. It signaled necessity. Love had not saved her. And that, stripped of illusion, was the beginning of the most difficult work she had ever faced. Time did not heal Avery. It clarified her. The weeks after the separation passed without spectacle, marked not by dramatic transformation, but by deliberate subtraction. She stopped performing stability and began practicing honesty, first in ways no one else could see. Mornings no longer started with obligation. She sat at the small kitchen table with coffee growing cold beside her and allowed herself to think without immediately converting thought into productivity. The silence that once felt threatening became instructional. It showed her where she had been avoiding herself. Leaving her father's company did not happen in a single decisive moment. It unfolded through preparation, paperwork, quiet resolve. Avery approached it the way she approached everything that mattered, carefully, thoroughly, without theatrics. There was no explosion, no grand declaration of independence. She did not leave to punish him or prove a point. She left because staying had become a lie she could no longer maintain. Her father reacted as expected, though seeing it clearly for the first time stripped his tactics of their power. He appealed to loyalty, to legacy, to her mother's memory. He framed departure as abandonment, independence as ingratitude. In the past, those arguments would have rooted her in place. Now, she recognized the fear beneath them. He was not protecting the company. He was protecting himself from solitude, from irrelevance, from the knowledge that control was his only remaining language. For the first time, Avery did not absorb his fear as her responsibility. She acknowledged it without internalizing it. His loneliness was real, but it was not hers to cure. That understanding felt less like rebellion and more like adulthood. She stepped away without slamming doors, without burning bridges, carrying only what belonged to her. With the space that followed, Avery returned to her writing with a different posture. She no longer wrote as if confessing or compensating. She wrote with steadiness, allowing fear to exist without letting it dictate her pace. The first draft of her novel took shape slowly, unevenly, accumulating weight through persistence rather than urgency. Finishing it did not feel triumphant. It felt grounding, like placing a solid object on the table and acknowledging its presence. Fear still visited her at night. It arrived quietly, familiar but less commanding. It questioned her choices, predicted failure, reminded her of everything she had lost. Avery did not argue with it. She learned to let it pass through without reorganizing her life around its warnings. Fear became information rather than authority. Her friendships changed in subtle ways. She stopped rescuing. She stopped preempting needs that were not hers to meet. She allowed herself to arrive empty-handed, without solutions, without emotional labor disguised as generosity. The adjustment was uncomfortable. It required resisting the impulse to earn belonging through usefulness. But in that discomfort, intimacy deepened. She discovered that closeness did not require constant vigilance. Sometimes it required stillness. She learned this lesson physically as well. Caring for fragile things no longer felt symbolic. It felt ordinary. The fish remained in its tank, but Avery no longer used it as a metaphor for her own containment. She noticed when she reached for control reflexively and practiced releasing it. She held vulnerability without translating it into management. She heard about Noah by accident. A mutual connection mentioned his upcoming move, casually, without awareness of the weight the information carried. The move was still happening, but differently than planned. Delayed. Adjusted. There was a narrow window before he left for good. The knowledge settled into Avery with quiet insistence. For days, she did nothing. She allowed the information to exist without forcing a response. She examined her impulse to retreat behind dignity, to interpret silence as strength. She recognized that avoidance could wear the costume of self-respect just as easily as fear once had. Eventually, the truth became unavoidable. She could either protect her pride or risk being seen. The choice was not abstract. It was immediate. When she went to him, she did not rehearse outcomes. She did not arrive with apologies designed to soften rejection or declarations meant to secure forgiveness. She did not promise permanence. She did not ask for rescue. What she brought instead was clarity. She offered presence without agenda, honesty without performance. She acknowledged what she could not guarantee and refused to disguise that uncertainty as humility. Noah did not respond with the urgency she might once have interpreted as indifference. He listened without reaching for resolution. Time had altered him as well. He no longer accepted love sustained by asymmetry, by patience that flowed in one direction. He had learned the cost of waiting for someone else to arrive where he already stood. The shift between them was subtle but decisive. This was no longer a story about convincing or persuading. It was about alignment. When he spoke again, the offer he made inverted every expectation Avery had carried. There were no vows, no timelines, no ceremonial escalation. What he proposed was restraint as commitment, an agreement not to rush toward a symbol that could become a substitute for truth. The promise ran counter to everything Avery had been taught to expect. It did not demand certainty. It demanded integrity. It required her to remain with him only as long as she remained with herself. Marriage, in this framing, was not the goal. It was a consequence that would only matter if it emerged naturally, without fear, without bargaining, without escape. For Avery, this was not delay. It was liberation. For the first time, love did not ask her to become smaller, quieter, more agreeable. It did not reward her for endurance or sacrifice. It asked for honesty sustained over time, even when fear resurfaced, even when certainty wavered. It asked her to stay present without guarantees, to choose connection without surrendering autonomy. The city at night wrapped around them without spectacle. Lights reflected off windows and pavement, softening the edges of buildings that looked harsh by day. The darkness was not ominous. It was protective, spacious enough to hold complexity without demanding resolution. Avery felt no rush toward closure. The absence of a perfect ending no longer frightened her. She chose continuation over conclusion. In doing so, she recognized the difference between endings designed to impress and endings that told the truth. Her story did not resolve into a tableau of certainty. It remained open, unfinished, alive. That openness no longer felt like danger. It felt like room. For the first time, Avery understood that love was not proven through endurance or permanence. It was proven through presence, renewed daily without coercion. The promise she accepted was not to be chosen forever, but to remain choosing honestly, even when fear returned. This was not a wedding. It was not a victory. It was something rarer. It was a life she recognized as her own. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.